This is Waan Talk Show, a weekly program broadcast from the very heart of Minneapolis, Minnesota on OROMIA11 TV station. Our today's special edition focuses on voices from neighbors, hydro or water politics and the issues of Horn of Africa. My special guest today is Ambassador Tibor Nagy, a veteran U.S. diplomat who was formerly Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He was also an ambassador to Guinea and Ethiopia. Currently, he is a Vice Provost and Adjunct Professor of International Affairs at Texas Tech University. For those of you who do not know what Vice Provost is, the same as in the academic rank in Ethiopia, like Second Vice President of Academic Affairs. And also Adjunct Professor means, probably some of my Ethiopian or African colleagues didn't know this, is somebody who retired from official posts from government or public service and then become a professor at university, is an adjunct or part-time professor teaching international affairs. Today we will have conversation on voices of neighbors, hydropolitics, and the issues of Horn of Africa. It is my honor and privilege to host such a charismatic, soft-spoken, with an immense treasure of knowledge, expertise, and experience on foreign services. Ambassador Nagy, thank you for taking my invitation to have conversation on this topic. And on behalf of my audience, I welcome you to this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I need to correct one thing you said. I was Vice Provost for International Affairs at Texas Tech between the time I retired from diplomacy in 2003 and I came back as Assistant Secretary of State. So now I have retired the third time in my life, but as you said, I am an adjunct professor at Texas Tech where I will be teaching from time to time on African issues.
Great. In line with that, I always ask my guests about 4E's so they can remember how they divide their life cycle, like early childhood education experience and their current engagement, what they do. And if you just give us briefly to my audience about that.
Yeah, well, my early childhood and education, of course, were not in America. As some of your listeners, I suspect, I came to the United States as a refugee. I was a war refugee from Hungary because my father was a military officer who fought against the communists. So my real life was growing up here, and my ambition was always to become an American diplomat. Sometimes God makes dreams come true, thankfully. And my education, I started school in Hungary, but when we came out here, I finished in the United States. I had my first degree from Texas Tech University and my second one from George Washington University. Lived in Washington, D.C. As you know, there's a huge Ethiopian community here also. But then moved to Texas. So right now we're back in Washington, D.C. Our home is, I think, all over the world. You know, some people ask me of my various homes, and I say, well, Hungary was one of my homes. The United States is one of my homes, but I think my other favorite home of all places is Ethiopia.
Great, thank you. People do not know what Bureau of African Affairs do within the Department of State, and most Ethiopians and most of even ordinary people who live here, immigrants, they think embassies, U.S. embassies can decide whatever they like by themselves on behalf of the country. So please give me a brief role of the Bureau of African Affairs.
Yeah, okay. So our Bureau of African Affairs in the Department of State is responsible for 47 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The U.S. government, unlike the African Union, we basically cut Africa above the Sahara and below the Sahara. And above the Sahara, the countries along the Mediterranean actually belong to our Near East Bureau, which covers the Arab world and Iran and Israel. But the rest of the continent is with the Africa Bureau. And I had 47 ambassadors that I actually supervised them. And policy is not decided by individual ambassadors. Policy is decided in Washington. Of course, the embassies can make recommendations on policy, but at the end of the day, for any administration, it's the president's policy. I worked, I think, during my time as a diplomat through 6 different administrations, and then I represented President Trump's administration as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. So the ambassadors can recommend a policy, I can recommend a policy, but at the end of the day, it's the White House and the president who decides, and then we are responsible for implementing it and also for explaining it. And as we get with some very complicated issues, like, we were talking about the Horn of Africa, there's so many important things going on there. You can imagine the very different points of view that people have, and at the end of the day, it's quite complicated to decide on what course of action to take. But again, once the president makes a decision, that's what we do. As soon as President Biden, as you saw, came into office, very soon after, he ended up sending Senator Coons to Ethiopia to take a personal look for him at the situation there, which shows how important the new administration considers the events in the Horn of Africa.
How do you articulate your performance during your tenure in Ethiopia as an ambassador? Any major accomplishment you are proud of? We can remember you the years to come.
Yeah, well, when I arrived in Ethiopia in 1999 as ambassador, the United States was very unpopular. Relations were terrible between Ethiopia and America because at that time the United States decided to be neutral in the Ethio-Eritrean War because the United States was trying to help bring about a peace settlement. So I found my reception to be very, very, very chilly. At that time, of course, Meles Zenawi was the prime minister, and it took several years to get to the point that he and I actually became quite good friends. When the Ethiopian army succeeded in overrunning the Eritrean defense lines, then both countries decided it was time to have a peace agreement, and the United States and Algeria together played a very important role in agreeing to the ceasefire and eventually the end of the war. Also, about the year 2000, there was a very serious drought, and there was the threat of massive starvation in parts of Ethiopia. The United States of America was the very first country, as we often are, to immediately put some mass quantities of food on the ocean, and the food arrived in Djibouti about 6 weeks after our embassy took a very active role. And although the war was still going on, the Ethiopian government provided a number of trucks to ship the food from Djibouti to the places in Ethiopia that needed it. from that point on, relations were very, very good. They became even better because I was ambassador on September 11th, 2001, during the attacks, the terrorist attacks. And at that point, the Ethiopian people as one were very, very supportive of what the United States was trying to do, because, as you know quite well, although America had their very first serious experience with terrorism on the homeland on 2001, although we had the embassy bombings earlier, Ethiopia had been victimized by terrorism for a long time before. So jointly together, we undertook very, very significant steps of cooperation to fight against the terrorists. And at that point, I would say that the relations between Ethiopia and the United States became extremely, extremely close. I stayed very close contact with Ethiopia because when I was in academia, I took a number of U.S. university groups to Ethiopia to help establish relationships with Ethiopian universities because including Adama, University of Adama, because Ethiopia was making tremendous progress in developing their own university section. And then, of course, when I came back as assistant secretary, Ethiopia was one of the first countries I visited. And things were going very, very well, as you and your community certainly knows. With Prime Minister Abiy receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Ethiopia making incredible progress, not only internally, but also in the region. And then, of course, we ended up with the very, very sad and tragic events of November, and then all of the related events which are going on, which unfortunately are taking the region in a very negative direction.
I think this question relates to your current or the previous assignment as Assistant Secretary of State, and I would like to ask you your involvement or Bureau of African Affairs involvement in resolving issues related with GERD or Grand Renaissance Dam of Ethiopia, and how you try to resolve those issues as a U.S. top diplomat on Africa. Tell me about how you looked at issues from Egyptian side, Sudanese side, and Ethiopian side, or other riparian countries.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because I remember just when I was leaving Ethiopia in 2002, my very last conversation then with Prime Minister Meles, as you all know, Meles was quite an intellectual. And, he told me his own thought that the next major war in Africa would be about water. So the whole issue of the Nile had been a critically important issue to not just Egypt. For Egypt, it's an existential issue, but also for Ethiopia. And of course, Sudan is caught in the middle, and the position of Sudan has gone back and forth. With the most recent GERD discussions, as you know, these negotiations have been taking place during a very sensitive time, especially for Sudan, because Sudan was undergoing the transformation from the Bashir government to a much, much more democratic, a much more forward-looking government of transition headed by Prime Minister Hamdok and the Transitional Military Council. So the three countries have their own very, very important positions in these negotiations. And they were coming at these negotiations from very different points of view. But for each of them, it is critically, critically important. And I can say that for the Egyptian public, but also for the Ethiopian public, the GERD is the issue on which everybody agrees. I mean, especially right now, as you well know, Matthias, there's tremendous division in the Ethiopian population, not only in Ethiopia, but also, the population living around the world as to how they see various issues that are going on. But I think I can safely say that 100% of the Ethiopian population is united in favor of progress on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And to a certain extent, you can say that about Egypt too. President Sisi is unpopular with some people, but when it comes to the dam, all Egyptians agree. The Sudanese, as I said, their position has shifted back and forth. Right now, they seem to be more on the Egyptian side, and how much of that is being influenced by what's going on in the Al-Fashqa triangle, I don't know. But of course, for Sudan, it's critically important because any change in the level of the Nile would have significant impact on the city of Khartoum. So we come to the position where the three countries have very different points of view. A number of international, people have gotten involved in this. Most recently, President Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as chair of the Africa Union has been involved, but there really has been no forward movement because of there's philosophical differences between the governments. I think what we can say, to be fair, we have to be absolutely fair and understanding, I think, of Prime Minister Abiy. He is facing an election in June. So the fact that he has to go into the elections puts on him certain restrictions on what he can and cannot do regarding the negotiations. And, I think after the elections, we will see if there will be more flexibility. I don't know. But the other factor, and your audience knows this, a lot of Americans don't understand the significance of the rainy season in African countries, but we know that the rain should be starting in Ethiopia June, then going on to July and August. And whether other people like it or not, the fact is that there will be a filling of the dam this year. The rains happen, so there's not anything that's going to stop that. So I suspect the international community means very well. The United States of America meant very well. Personally, I will tell your audience that my recommendation was for the United States not to become involved in those negotiations at that point. But as I said, that the decisions are made by the president. President wanted the United States to be there, and the United States was there. What happens sometimes with these negotiations is that at the end of the day, the person who is doing the mediation, everybody gets mad at them. And, this time the Ethiopians, I know, felt like the United States was not playing an objective role. And we will see how they go. But the bottom line is, dam is going to be built. And sooner or later, there's going to be an agreement on the operation because all three countries need to come to an agreement. We just have to give it a bit of time, and I think that there will be successful.
Thank you. I believe these two countries, especially Egypt and Ethiopia, use this water hydropolitics as an instrument or as a tool to quell dissent in their own countries, to get mass mobilization, and go unilaterally to push their agendas. I know the Grand Renaissance Dam has an advantage even for Egypt and Sudan to control even the flooding of the rainy season. And because this is not the evaporation in the deserts down the road from Sudan to Egypt is higher than in Ethiopia. So if the water is contained inside Ethiopia, it might have advantage over long time. But how do you reflect on that they use this as a tool to quell dissent in their own countries, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt?
I don't think they use it as a tool to quell displeasure with the government. I think both governments use it as a tool for popular support. I mean, as I said, I believe that 100% of Ethiopians, people, especially since it was the Ethiopian people who paid for the dam, are supportive of the Ethiopian government's position to be tough in the negotiations. The Egyptians very much feel the same way. So as the dam is being built, the two populations are being supportive of their own governments. But again, as I said, I think it's absolutely clear that the dam is going to be built, the dam is going to be finished, and the countries have to come to an agreement. And the big problem, you talked about the problem of inundations and too much water. I don't think they have any problems on agreeing on what to do when there's too much water. I think the real problem, and this is a huge problem for Egypt, is what happens when there's not enough water. Because Egypt depends 100% for their agriculture on the Nile. So for them, as I said, this is more of an existential issue than it is for anybody else. And then, as we all know, there have been historical grievances. When the initial treaties were signed on use of the Nile waters, Ethiopia was a very weak state, and Egypt was a much, much stronger state. As we know now, with the way developments have been going, Ethiopia has had tremendous development over the last decades. The population has grown. I don't know now if it's 110 million or 120 million, but it's I think everybody agrees that it's the second most populous country in Africa. The economy is one of the fastest growing in the world. There's been tremendous progress in things like education, including university education. The Ethiopian armed forces proved just how strong they were in the Ethio-Eritrean War. So once upon a time when all of the advantages were on the Egyptian side, and if Egypt was unhappy over what Ethiopia was doing, I'm sure the Egyptians believed that they could send the Egyptian army up into the mountains of Ethiopia to force Ethiopia to do what Egypt wanted. Well, that is no longer the case. There's certainly no proof that militarily Egypt is superior to Ethiopia, and so the geopolitical power now is much more even. And since Ethiopia was under the thumb of Egypt for all of those years, now I'm sure there's a certain amount of feeling on the Ethiopian side that those days are over. That Ethiopia's voice now is just as loud as anybody else's, and that Ethiopia's point of view on this issue has to be respected and considered.
Thank you. My next question is about a military. There were several joint military drill between Sudan and Egypt recently, probably a couple of months ago, on several occasions. Do you think this is a scare tactic, or they are preparing themselves to strike the dam? And if this scenario would happen, what would be U.S. Probably you are not a policy maker at this time, but your reflection might help the policy formulator. So how do you reflect about U.S. response to that if the strike happens?
Well, here's the thing. Egypt and Sudan have a number of common issues. So it's quite understandable, especially with the changes going on in Sudan, that their armed forces would be, moving forward instead of backwards, especially on their points of view. I mean, I had an opportunity to meet the high-ranking Sudanese military people, the new ones, during my time. So I don't see anything overly negative in Sudan and Egypt doing joint maneuvers. Obviously, they do want to send the signal that they have a lot of commonly shared values between them, which is absolutely true. I don't believe that there's any chance whatsoever that Egypt by itself or Egypt with Sudan is going to undertake military action against Ethiopia on the dam. Ethiopia has not taken any steps that would, threaten Sudan and or Egypt, and Ethiopia remains open to ongoing discussions. They have different points of view, but as I said, I think that the discussions sooner or later will lead to an agreement, even if they have a partial agreement, because the disagreement is on just a few issues. It's not on the overall situation. So no one is saying that the dam should not be built. Also, as I said before, Egypt would have to think very, very carefully before undertaking any military action against Ethiopia, because there's no guarantee that Egyptian military action would succeed. And to make it further complicated, if you remember, the Egyptians themselves have a huge dam, that they built, and if they undertake to threaten Ethiopia's dam, then what would prevent Ethiopia from thinking about threatening the Egyptian dam? So I honestly do not believe that there's a military option on the table. And I think that the international community on this, we may disagree with the Chinese, we may disagree with the Russians, but on this, the entire international community would be united that there should be no military action involved regarding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Thank you for that reflection. I agree. We all, even the United States or American people, there is no, they have no any intention to hurt or to want the sufferings of the Ethiopian people or Egyptian or Sudanese who are recipients of this river or Nile River. And the Grand Renaissance Dam can ease the burden of our mothers and sisters and brothers back in Africa. And all of us who watch this show like that dam to be completed and provide some, power to the people, and who watch all over the world. They resist oppression, they resist a system, but they like and they love their countries. The water politics is connected to the domestic politics. Currently, the Ethiopian regime or the Ethiopian government is weak, and in most of the areas are in conflict, and the violence is raging the country. As a most senior U.S. diplomat, recent diplomat on Africa, how do you reflect on that? Because since the government is weak and cannot negotiate, or they do not have negotiation tool, it affects the process. So how do you reflect to that?
Yeah, the violence in Ethiopia, I mean, if we look at it, there's different reasons for different parts of the violence. I mean, I think we all know that because first starting with the Derg and then the Meles government that followed it with the ethnic federalism, I mean, the Meles government obviously was an improvement over the Derg, but it certainly, did not go far enough to liberalize the government and to allow, freedom of expression and genuinely free elections. So they had what I would call a pressure cooker, because you had all of these ethnic forces, within Ethiopia that were heating up, but the way the government was that it kept this very, very tight lid on these forces. So when Prime Minister Abiy took over, one of the very, very delicate tasks his government had to do was to let the steam out of the pressure cooker without it, blowing off the lid. So you started having all of these violent eruptions in those areas where you had different ethnic groups in Ethiopia coming up against other ethnic groups. And as you said, if you remember, initially they had problems in the Somali region with the then regional president, the Liu police, Benen Shangul. You had the problem, of course, in the Amhara region, which is recent, because after the TPLF and the Eritrean took over the government, if you remember, there were a number of Waradas that had belonged to the Amhara state, and they were given over to Tigray. So there were all of these grievances built in, or in the Harari zone, Dirdawa, all over the country there were these areas that had the ethnic problems. And as you said, the government, it'd be very difficult for any government to deal with all of those problems simultaneously. Then you had on top of that, of course, the conflict which broke out in Tigray when the TPLF militia attacked the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, and just the incredible suffering that unleashed. And then at the same time, of course, you had the Al-Fashqa Triangle, which had been occupied by the Ethiopian army, even though there had been agreements between Ethiopia and Sudan as to who it actually belonged to. I think there was no disagreement that the residents of the area were mostly Ethiopians, but they were not paying taxes to Sudan. They were paying taxes to Ethiopia. But when the Ethiopian National Defense Forces withdrew from there to go to Tigray, then you had the conflict with the Sudanese army coming in. Then you had militias from the Ethiopian side engage with the Sudanese armed forces. So it appears that there's so many different types of conflict that are popping up all over the country. But Matthias, here's one thing about Ethiopia that I think all of us agree on, is that Ethiopia is the only country in sub-Saharan Africa which is a product of history and geography, and not European colonizers standing around a map of Africa in Berlin in the 1880s and drawing these imaginary lines and creating countries where countries did not exist before. I mean, Ethiopia is as real and historic a country as China, as Iran, as Turkey, as anything else. So you have a lot of this violence going on right now at the surface, but if you dig below that, Ethiopia is about as solid a country as exists on Earth. And I think we can also agree that in thousands of years there will be a country, there will be an Ethiopia, because it's just one of those special places on Earth.
Thank you. Follow-up question is that you raised a new phrase in political sphere. You said pressure cooker. Are you optimistic this pressure cooker doesn't explode into all-out civil war? But there are a lot of empirical and factual on-the-ground indications that the country is in violent conflicts everywhere, from north to south, east to west.
Yeah, my personal opinion is I don't see the pressure cooker exploding, and I'll tell you why. If the elections come off successfully, and if there is true economic growth, as there was before COVID, then I think that the country can have a very, very bright future. If you look at other examples of countries that fall apart, you know, we can compare Ethiopia to two countries. One, the way it grew up, we can compare it to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multi-ethnic empire. Or we can compare it to Yugoslavia. Both of those countries did very, very well while they were together. Once they fell apart, they did much, much worse, especially, you know, if you look at Yugoslavia, what happened there, some of the parts are okay, but unfortunately a lot of those parts are suffering and have been suffering since the country fell apart. So that's one. The other example I will give you is there is a country where you have three ethnic groups who historically have really, really disliked each other and have fought several wars against each other. And that country is doing magnificently well. I often ask my students to guess what country that might be, and they come up with all kinds of, you know, possibilities, but I have never had anybody give me the right answer, because that country happens to be Switzerland, where you have Germans, you have French, and you have Italians, and they get along magnificently well. Of course, the big difference is that in Switzerland, the population divides riches as opposed to dividing poverty. So I really do think that the key to the future of a multi-ethnic country like Ethiopia is a much better governance, but also rapid economic development. That the people who live there have a reason to support the state formation, and the state development.
But though, again, another follow-up question: the election, honestly speaking, is we see just one group of people are debating with each other, while systematically kicked out everybody and put others with progressive ideas in jail. For example, Jawar Mohammed and Bakale Garba are now in prison, and other opposition groups like OLF, Oromo Federalist Congress, they are systematically marginalized and pushed out of the election process. So I can say over 70-80% of the population is not participating in even voting for their representative. And it's only 1 month away. I think it's June 5th or June 6th is the coming election.
June 15th, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so one group of people can run for offices, and while the majority of the population is left out. So how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, here's the bottom line. Democracy, as you well know, does not happen immediately. In democratic development, you can take a picture of a country at any one point and look at the picture and find many, many things wrong with it. The most important thing is to look at the trend line. What direction is the line going in? To me, the fundamental issue in any election, no matter which election it is, anywhere in the world, there's one fundamental issue. Is the government in power willing to have itself voted out of power in that election? If the answer is no, and I used to tell my ambassador colleagues this when I was in Ethiopia, if the answer is no, then you can have 1 million election observers standing shoulder to shoulder, and at the end of the election, the result was going to be the same. The government will remain in power. So to me, that is the key element to look at, is for the elections coming up in June, for the first time in Ethiopia's history, is this election going to be one where the government is willing to have itself voted out of power? Prime Minister Abiy says yes. We will have to see what the evidence shows going, before the election, on the election, but most importantly, after the election. Democratic development in Ethiopia is not going to be a straight line. It's going to be, as the old communist founder Lenin said, sometimes you take 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. The important thing is, are you moving forward or are you moving backward? And frankly, Matthias, we'll have to see. You and I can sit here making predictions and discussing, but as the Americans say, the proof is in the pudding. We will see how the elections turn out. We will see what the conclusion of the elections are. And after that, I think the international community, but more importantly, the Ethiopian people, will have to decide, how they viewed the elections.
Great, thank you. I agree. Let us wait and see how things work out in the next 2-3 months. Who knows? Let me move to some most personal questions. And do you have any regrets you can do differently if you go back to Department of State in other capacity as Assistant Secretary of State or as a Secretary of State?
Yeah, I do. And this is an Ethiopia's neighbor. I think the United States has been pursuing a policy in Somalia which has not led to any kind of a positive outcome. We have been ignoring the country of Somaliland, and I think that the whole international community has been making a mistake in that, because on the one hand you have the little country of Somaliland, which works very, very well. They have real elections. They don't get any assistance, or they get very little assistance from the international community. And they are not recognized by anyone except Taiwan. And right next door you have the nation of Somalia, which has sucked in billions and billions of dollars of international assistance and really has nothing to show for it except a government that seems to be only interested in perpetuating itself in power. So, one of my biggest regrets is not really pushing for a different U.S. government policy on how we deal with Somalia and Somaliland. My other big regrets, these are countries away from Ethiopia, but I'm really sorry that I'm leaving, that I left as Assistant Secretary of State, and the situation in Cameroon has not improved. Between the Anglophones and the rest of Cameroon. And I'm also very sorry that the situation in Zimbabwe has not improved, because that country has so many positive things going for it that it could easily be a leader in many different areas, and it could be a middle-income country, but that has a government that is absolutely not interested in the welfare of its own people.
Yeah, it's good to recognize what didn't work and then plan for the future correction, and we can take corrective action in the future. That's why I ask this question. Thank you very much again. And let me ask you some personal questions or about your cultural intelligence. What did you enjoy about Ethiopia when you travel in Oromia and other parts of the country?
Well, as I said, I consider Ethiopia my third home. I was very touched. I've never been as touched in my life as by the kindness of the Ethiopian people after the September 11th terrorist attacks. That was very, very touching for me. Ethiopia, as all of your listeners know, has one of the most unique cultures in the world. If ever if I'm feeling a little bit negatively, I will get online and I will search out some of the Ethiopian football songs that Ethiopians sing to cheer on the football teams, and they're very, very uplifting to me. They always make me feel better. And one of my favorite Ethiopian singers is Gigi. I really like her music, but just about any Ethiopian song I like. And then you have this magical food called kitpo. My wife gets very angry with me when I eat it because I like it in the traditional Ethiopian style. But for me, it is one of the world's greatest delicacies.
Great. Any strange moment or funny moment you remember?
Well, one thing I can say about Ethiopia, my first time in Ethiopia was in 1984 during the Derg. And I remember driving from the airport, from Boli, to the embassy, and we passed, I think it was the GAR, the railroad station, and I looked out and I was amazed to see that these World War II Italian trucks were still being used. They were still running. And I said to myself, what kind of magical people are these who can keep these, World War II trucks still in good repair to where they can be used, for doing work. I said, at that point, I said to myself that I have really come to a very special place. And of course, everything that's happened reinforced that. The other thing where I always laugh about, when I was ambassador, I traveled all over the country. I think the only ambassador that has visited more places in Ethiopia than I did was Ambassador Shin. I have to say that he did more than, but I tried to go everywhere, and including some of the places where there was, I thought, no human being. But the instant I would stop, immediately there would be at least 50 children who would come running out. And, and we know that every little Ethiopian kid knows the word Ferengi. So, so I would be surrounded by these, 50 to 100 little kids, reminding me that I was a Ferengi, and wanting to share whatever I had.
Yeah, that's great. And your last word for the Oromo, Ethiopian, and African people who watch this show 10, 20, 30 years from today?
Well, my last words are that this truly will be Africa's century. And I thank God for the young people in Africa, because it's not the old leaders who are going to change the continent, but it's the young people who are going to truly put it in a place in the world where Africa truly belongs. So I have all of my faith in the young people of Africa. Let the old dictators go away and bring on the youth. Ambassador
Nagy, thank you very much. And it is really an honor and privilege to have this conversation with you as a top U.S. diplomat on Horn of Africa and Africa, by the way. And I will reach out to you in the future if I need some reflections on current situation around Africa, Horn of Africa, U.S. relations. And I hope you will visit us when things opens up. You will visit us here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There are Oromos and Somalis and other Ethiopians, immigrants reside. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and expertise and reflections.
Thanks, Matthias, and all the best to your wonderful program. And truly, God bless Ethiopia.
With this, we conclude our special edition of today's program. Until next time, goodbye.